WW2, 47 inches the afternoon, December 20th, 1943. The sky above Germany is breathing fire. Beneath the heavy grey clouds, 16 massive B-17 flying fortresses cut through the winter air metal giants, weighing 30 tons each, packed with bombs destined for German factories, carrying with them 11 men per aircraft, 11 hearts racing with terror, 11 sets of lungs struggling for oxygen at 27,000 feet. The German flak bursts all around them like metal rain. The engines scream their death songs. The smell of burnt oil, cordite, and blood fills every crevice of the fuselage. A young bombardier lies bleeding on the floor, coughing up dark liquid, his eyes fixed on a sky he'll never see again. Second Lieutenant Charlie Brown, just 21 years old, from a small farm in West Virginia, has his hands locked on the control yoke of his B-17F bomber, Ye Old Pub. He can feel her dying beneath his fingers. The right wing is shattered. The tail section is barely hanging on. Through holes torn in the aluminum skin, he can see daylight on the other side. The landing gear won't come down. 3 of the 4 engines are wounded, gasping. Hydraulics are leaking. The radio is dead. There's no communication with the other bombers. No call for help. No hope. His tail gunner is dead, frozen stiff, still slumped over his machine gun. His blood turned to ice crystals in the sub-zero air. And then he hears it. A different engine sound. Sharper. More aggressive. Coming from above and to the right. He glances over, and his heart stops. A grey German fighter, a Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6, is sliding into position, just 3 feet from his wingtip. Too close to miss, too close to survive. Brown closes his eyes for 1 second. He thinks this is the end, but what happens in the next moment will change history. Before we get to that impossible moment, we need to go back. We need to go back to Wrocław, Polish now, but German then in the year 1915, where a boy was born into poverty so complete that survival itself was a victory. His name, Franz Wilmot Adolf Stigler. His father worked in a factory. His mother sewed until her fingers bled. The family lived in 2 small rooms with a coal stove and 1 window facing a narrow street filled with workers and horses and the endless noise of industrial Germany. Franz was the middle child, 3 older brothers, 2 younger sisters. Hunger was the uninvited guest at every meal. His mother would divide 1 loaf of bread into 7 pieces, making sure each child received their portion, never more, never less. His father would return from the factory black with soot and oil, collapse onto his cot, and fall asleep without dinner. The children always came first. But Franz was different. He was a dreamer. He would stand in the backyard and stare at the sky. On clear days, he could see aeroplanes passing overhead. German mail planes in peacetime, carrying letters and passengers to distant cities. He would run after them until his lungs burned, until his legs couldn't carry him anymore, watching them disappear into the clouds. "I'll become a pilot," he told his mother. She smiled sadly. She knew that poor boys' dreams usually died before they ever learned to fly. But sometimes life surprises you. In 1933, when Franz turned 18, Adolf Hitler came to power in Germany. The Führer wanted a strong military. The Führer wanted pilots. The Führer wanted the sky filled with German eagles. Franz applied to the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force. Through some connections, through people who knew people, he managed to get an interview. But, honestly, he didn't need help. His talent was obvious from the first moment. His eyes had perfect vision. His hands were steady. His mind worked like a calculator. The way he understood machinery as if he could speak its language. Within months, he was learning to fly. Within a year, he was in combat. By 1936, at just 21 years old, he was assigned to Jagdgeschwader 27, Fighter Squadron 27, one of the elite units of the Luftwaffe. And now, in December 1943, at 28 years old, he was an ace. 27 confirmed kills. 27 times he had sent enemy aircraft spiraling toward the Earth in flames. 27 times he had succeeded where others had failed. But every kill had a cost. He had watched good friends die. He had seen entire squadrons reduced to single aircraft. He had buried more brothers than he could count, and something inside him was breaking. By December 1943, the war had been grinding on for 4 years. Germany was losing. Everyone knew it. The generals knew it. The soldiers knew it. The civilians knew it. The Allies were getting stronger every day. More bombers, faster fighters, more factories producing weapons. The American war machine, which everyone had thought would be soft and weak, turned out to be a steel monster that never stopped, never slept, never surrendered. The German Luftwaffe was being bled to death. Young pilots, barely trained, barely old enough to shave, were being sent up against American bomber formations with fighter cover. Most of them died on their first mission. Some died on their first sortie, within minutes of taking off. Franz had seen it happen too many times. Teenagers in cockpits, boys who should have been in university or learning a trade, who instead were screaming through the sky at 400 miles per hour, trying to shoot down aircraft piloted by men with years of experience. The system was killing them. Slowly, systematically. And Franz, as an experienced pilot, was expected to lead them, to mentor them, and watch them die. On this particular morning, December 20th, 1943, Franz was at his airfield, Assinghausen, located near Bremen. The alarm had sounded. American bombers were coming. The entire unit scrambled. 20 fighters rushed to intercept. Franz climbed into his Bf-109 G6, a beautiful machine, sleek and powerful, but with a fatal weakness. There was an American .50 caliber bullet lodged in his engine's radiator. He was supposed to get it repaired, but there wasn't time. He took off anyway. The climb was brutal. The radiator temperature was climbing dangerously. He could see the needle on the gauge creeping toward the red zone. If the engine overheated, he would lose power. If he lost power at high altitude, he would fall like a stone. But he kept climbing anyway, because that was what you did. That was what a German fighter pilot did. You flew through pain. You flew through fear. You flew until you couldn't fly anymore. The bomber formation was above him now, moving like a great flock of mechanical geese. B-17 seconds. The most heavily armed bombers in the world, each one bristling with machine guns, tail gunner, waist gunners, top turret, nose guns. It was like flying into a fortress. Franz and the other German fighters attacked. The sky became chaos. Fire and smoke and traces cutting through the air in brilliant lines. The screams of engines being pushed beyond their limits. The smell of burning fuel and explosives. The terrible beauty of aerial combat. The dance between life and death, played out at 25,000 feet above the earth. Franz managed to damage several of the bombers. He saw one break away from the formation, dropping lower and lower, struggling to maintain altitude. It was severely damaged, missing part of its tail section, trailing smoke, clearly struggling to stay aloft. He pursued it. The bomber was heading lower and lower, trying to get to a safer altitude where oxygen became less critical, where his crew could function better. Franz pushed his damaged fighter to follow, and then, suddenly, the main American formation turned away. Perhaps they were low on fuel. Perhaps they had completed their bombing run. Perhaps they had simply decided that the cost was too high. They pulled up and began heading back toward the English Channel, toward home, toward safety. But one bomber, the damaged one, was left behind, alone, struggling, dying. Franz was so focused on pursuit that at first he didn't notice where he was. But then he realized the damaged bomber was flying low over the German coast, very low, only a few hundred feet above the ground, and below him he could see an airfield, Assinghausen, his own base. The bomber was so damaged, so slow, that even with his overheating engine, he caught up easily. Soon he was flying just 30 feet away from the American aircraft, close enough to see the damage clearly. The fuselage was torn open in dozens of places. He could see the ribs of the aircraft's internal structure. He could see men moving inside, manning guns, tending to wounded, desperately trying to keep their aircraft in the air. And in the tail position, visible through the broken framework, he could see a man slumped over a machine gun. The man wasn't moving, wasn't breathing. Blood was frozen in red icicles on the gun mount. The tail gunner was dead. Franz's radiator temperature was now deep into the red. His engine was overheating. He had maybe minutes before the engine seized completely. This was the moment. This was his opportunity. One burst from his cannon. One short burst. That was all it would take. A heavily damaged B-17, struggling to stay aloft, with a dead tail gunner and a crippled crew. An easy kill. An easy victory. And it would be his 19th kill toward the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross, one of the highest honors in the Third Reich. Just one more. Just one more bomber, and he would be eligible for the award. Just one more. Franz positioned himself behind the B-17's tail section. in the perfect firing position. His finger moved toward the trigger, and then he paused, because in that moment, something happened inside him. Something that can't really be explained. Something that goes beyond logic and reason and military doctrine and orders from above. He remembered something. A conversation. Years ago. In North Africa. Before the war had ground him down to this present moment. He had been flying with a unit under the command of Major Gustav Rodel, a man Franz respected, a man who carried himself with honor and with dignity, even in the chaos of war. One day, Rodel had called Franz to his tent. "Stigler," he said, "if I ever see or hear of you shooting at a man in a parachute, I will shoot you down myself. You understand? These aren't rules of engagement handed down by command. These are rules of honor. Rules that we keep, not for our enemy, but for ourselves. You fight by the rules to keep your humanity. Without rules, we become animals." Franz had never forgotten those words. And now, looking at the B-17 through his gun sight, through the holes torn in its fuselage, seeing the wounded American airmen inside, seeing them desperately trying to save their own lives, and the lives of their crewmates, it felt like he was looking at men in parachutes, helpless, injured, trapped, unable to fight back, unable to defend themselves, and something inside him said, "No, I won't do this." Franz pulled back on the stick. His fighter rose away from the B-17. He did not fire. Charlie Brown, in the cockpit of the B-17, saw the German fighter pull away. At first he thought, "This is it. He's going to attack from above. He's repositioning for the kill." He tensed. He gripped the yoke tighter. He prepared himself and his crew for the end, but the attack never came. Instead, something even more impossible happened. The German fighter, the Messerschmitt, pulled up alongside the bomber's left wing, only 30 feet away. Close enough that Brown could see the pilot's face, close enough that they could see each other's eyes. Franz stared at Brown. Brown stared at Franz. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Neither of them spoke. There was no radio communication possible. The B-17's radios were damaged, probably shot out during the earlier fighter attacks. But in that moment, something passed between them. Some wordless understanding. Some recognition of a shared humanity that transcended nationality and uniform and ideology. Franz raised his hand. Then he mimed something with his hands and arms. He gestured toward the German coast, making a diving motion, as if indicating, "Land your plane. Land at my airfield. Surrender. At least you'll live." Brown didn't understand. Or he did understand, but he refused. If they landed in Germany, they would be prisoners of war. They might be interrogated. They might be shot. Even if they lived, they would spend the rest of the war. And who knew how long that would be in a German prison camp? No. Brown shook his head. Franz tried again. He pointed toward the north. Sweden. If they could reach Sweden, they could land safely. Sweden was neutral. They would be interned for the remainder of the war. But they would be alive. They would receive medical treatment. But Brown still didn't understand. Or he refused to understand. The aircraft was damaged so badly that he was focused solely on one thing, keeping it in the air long enough to get back to England. Everything else was secondary. So Franz made a decision. If the American wouldn't land in Germany, if he wouldn't divert to Sweden, then Franz would do the only thing he could do. He would protect him. Franz maneuvered his fighter to fly directly alongside the B-17, in perfect formation. So close that their wings were nearly touching. He positioned himself on the bomber's port side, the left side, placing his fighter directly between the damaged American aircraft and the German anti-aircraft batteries scattered along the coast. This was the act that could get him executed. If a ground spotter saw his tail markings helping an Allied bomber escape German airspace, he could be court-martialed and shot. Even a whisper of suspicion, Stigler helped an American escape, would be enough. The Nazi regime had already executed pilots for less, but Franz didn't care anymore. He was tired. Tired of killing. Tired of watching young men die. Tired of a system that valued death over humanity. The two aircraft, one damaged American bomber and one German fighter with an overheating engine, flew together toward the coast, toward the North Sea, toward freedom. Below them, the German anti-aircraft gunners on the ground saw them coming. They saw the B-17. Their fingers moved toward the triggers of their guns, but they also saw the German fighter flying in close escort, flying in protection, flying in escort formation with the bomber. No German pilot would escort an enemy aircraft. Therefore, the man on the ground reasoned, this must be a German aircraft. An unusual-looking German aircraft, perhaps, but definitely German. So they held their fire. It was a trick, a deception, a moment of chance and circumstance that saved American lives. The two aircraft crossed the coast of Germany and flew out over the North Sea. The cold, grey, infinite expanse of open water stretched before them. They were over open water now. They were beyond German territory, beyond the reach of German flak, beyond the authority of German command. Franz knew his engine was about to fail. He could feel it. The needle on the temperature gauge was buried in the red. The engine was screaming in protest. He had maybe minutes. He pulled up alongside the B-17 one final time. He looked at Charlie Brown through the cockpit window, and he saluted. It was a moment of perfect military courtesy, a moment of recognition between warriors, a moment of honor in the midst of a war that had lost its honor. Then Franz turned his fighter around and headed back toward Germany, back toward his base, back toward whatever fate awaited him. Charlie Brown and his crew made it back to England. The B-17 was so damaged that it barely stayed aloft for the crossing of the North Sea. The engines that were still working were running on fumes. The hydraulics were leaking. Half the crew was wounded. The flight took agonizing hours, but they landed. They survived. When they landed at their base in England, the other pilots and crew members were astounded. They had seen the damage to the B-17 with their own eyes. They had watched it struggling to keep altitude. They had assumed it was impossible for the aircraft to make it back. And when Brown tried to tell them what happened about the German fighter that didn't shoot, about the escort to the coast, about the salute, nobody believed him. You were hallucinating from lack of oxygen, they said. You were delirious with pain, they said. No German pilot would do such a thing. But Brown knew what he had seen. He knew what had happened. For the rest of his life, he would carry the memory of that impossible moment. He would carry the image of the German pilot's face. He would carry the question, who was that man? Why did he do it? For Franz, back in Germany, there were different consequences. His commanding officer noticed something odd. A bomber had escaped, a heavily damaged bomber, flying low over German territory, and no fighter had attacked it. No fighter had reported engaging the enemy. There was an investigation. Franz was questioned. Where was he during this time? What had he seen? Franz knew he was walking a razor's edge. One wrong word, one hint that he had deliberately allowed an American bomber to escape, and he would be court-martialed. He might be shot, so he lied. He said his engine had overheated. He said he had to break off pursuit. He said he never got a clear shot. The story was plausible enough. The engine damage was real. They found the bullet lodged in his radiator. The explanation was logical. He was not court-martialed. He was not executed, but he was questioned, and in the higher ranks of the Luftwaffe, whispers began to circulate. Strange rumors. Stigler had let a bomber escape. Stigler wasn't as committed to the Nazi cause as other pilots. His days as a fighter pilot were numbered. Within weeks, he was reassigned. No longer flying combat missions. No longer in the elite Jagdgeschwader 27. He was transferred to a training unit, teaching younger pilots how to fly, safely behind the lines, away from combat, away from the temptation to commit such acts of mercy again. For the next 46 years, Charlie Brown wondered about the German pilot. He tried to find him. He wrote letters to official organizations. He attended pilots' reunions. He spent his own money searching through military records, both American and German. He asked other veterans if they had ever heard of a Luftwaffe pilot who had shown mercy to a downed bomber. Nothing. No answers. No leads. The pilot had become a ghost, a phantom, a man who had existed for one perfect moment and then disappeared into history. Brown married. He had children. He had a career. He lived a full life. But there was always this unanswered question, this ghost that haunted him. Who was that man? Where did he go? Did he survive the war? For his part, Franz Stigler survived the war in Germany. He lived through the final years of the Nazi regime. He was not captured by the Russians or executed by the Gestapo. He was interned briefly after the war, but eventually released. In 1953, he immigrated to Canada. He changed his name slightly from Stigler to Stigler and started a new life. He became a businessman. He became prosperous. He married and had a family. He lived quietly and peacefully in Vancouver, British Columbia. But he never forgot the young American pilot. Like Brown, he wondered about him constantly. Did he survive? Did his crew make it back safely? Did they live good lives? Franz mentioned it occasionally to his family. There was this one time during the war, an American bomber. I could have shot him down. I chose not to. I wonder if he ever made it home. It became part of his personal mythology, the one act of mercy in a war filled with cruelty. Then, in 1990, everything changed. Charlie Brown was at home in the United States, still searching. He had tried everything official. He decided to try one more thing. He placed an advertisement in a German newsletter for former Luftwaffe pilots. He retold the story. He asked, "Does anyone know who this pilot was?" A few weeks later, a letter arrived. Charlie's hands shook as he opened it. "Dear Charles," it began. "All these years I wondered what happened to that B-17. Did she make it home? Did her crew survive their wounds? To hear of your survival has filled me with indescribable joy. My name is Franz Stigler. I am the pilot you are looking for." It was him. After 47 years, the two men had found each other. Franz wrote that he would be visiting Florida that summer and suggested they meet in person. But Charlie couldn't wait. He called Directory Assistance in Vancouver and asked for Franz Stigler's number. He dialed, and Franz answered the phone. "Hello?" The voice was accented, German, older, but it was alive and real. And there. "Is this Franz Stigler?" Charlie asked. "Yes. Who is calling?" "This is Charlie Brown, the American pilot." There was a long silence on the other end of the phone. Then Franz's voice came again, and it was filled with emotion. "Charlie? My God, Charlie! You made it! You made it home!" They talked for hours. They told each other their stories. They laughed. They cried. They became friends in that moment. As much as two people separated by 40 years and an entire ocean could become friends. That summer, they finally met in person, for the first time since that December day in 1943. They embraced like brothers. They looked into each other's faces and saw the young men they had been. One American, one German, enemies for a moment, brothers forever. "Why did you do it?" Charlie asked. "Because," Franz said, "I saw humans in that aircraft. Not enemies, humans." From that moment on, Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler were inseparable. They traveled together. They gave speeches together. They told their story to schools and universities and military academies. They became ambassadors for peace. They showed the world that even in war, mercy was possible, that enemies could become friends, that humanity could transcend ideology. Their story was remarkable, not just because it had happened, but because of what it represented. In a war that had been so brutal, so total, so devoid of mercy, they had found a moment of grace, a moment when a man chose humanity over hatred, a moment when a man remembered his own father's teaching about honor and chose to honor it even when doing so could have cost him his life. The military took notice. Historians began studying their story, books were written about them, documentaries featured them. They became part of the historical record, no longer ghosts or whispers, but living proof that mercy was possible. Other pilots came forward with their own stories of encounters with mercy during the war. Stories that had been hidden for decades because they contradicted the official narrative of total, unrelenting warfare. Stories of pilots who had spared other pilots. Stories of soldiers who had recognized the humanity of their enemies. Franz Stigler's actions were officially recognized. He was honored not just by American organizations, but by military institutions around the world. Young pilots studying aerial combat learned about him. Military academies discussed him in their ethics classes. Most importantly, he and Charlie Brown showed something that the world needed to see. That war did not have to strip away all humanity. That choices mattered. That a single act of mercy could echo across decades, could change people's lives, could inspire millions. Franz Stigler lived for many decades in peaceful retirement in Canada. He never sought the spotlight. He was, by all accounts, a quiet, humble man who never seemed to fully grasp the magnitude of what he had done. In his own mind, he was just following the code of honor that had been taught to him by his commanding officer. He was just following his conscience. It was the right thing to do, he would say simply. And he died on the 22nd of March 2008 at the age of 92. Charlie Brown died that same year, in November, just 8 months later. It was as if losing his friend had taken something essential from him, but their legacy lived on. Why does this story matter? Because in a world that often feels like it's tearing itself apart, a world where we see enemies, not humans, a world where we see those who disagree with us as threats to be destroyed, Rather than people to be understood, we need this story. We need to remember that Franz Stigler, an ace of the Luftwaffe, one of the German military's elite pilots, could still choose mercy. We need to remember that Charlie Brown, under attack, abandoned to die, facing an enemy fighter, could still recognize the humanity of the man attacking him. We need to remember that even in the worst conditions imaginable in war, at 30,000 feet, with death approaching at 400 miles per hour, humans could still choose to be human. The story of Franz Stigler and Charlie Brown is a reminder that we always have a choice, that no matter what we've been taught, no matter what our orders are, no matter what the system demands of us, we always have the choice to do the right thing. And sometimes, the most revolutionary act we can commit is an act of mercy toward our enemy. This is the true meaning of unthinkable, not because it was impossible, but because it was so rare that when it did happen, it became legendary. It became immortal. For 50 years, Charlie Brown wondered about Franz Stigler. For 50 years, Franz Stigler wondered about Charlie Brown. And when they finally found each other, they discovered that mercy had connected them across all those years, that a single act of kindness could echo across 4.5 decades and forge a friendship stronger than any weapon, deeper than any hatred, more powerful than any ideology. They became brothers, not in blood, but in spirit, and their story became a beacon that shows us what's possible when we choose humanity, a beacon that shows us what we could be if we simply remembered that our enemies are human too.